Welcome to Beyond Conversation today as we discuss the radio play Black and Blue, which is written by Shepsu Aku and directed by Andrea J. Diamond. The play explores the conflicted allegiance of two Black Chicago police officers following the aftermath of the release of the video depicting the killing of Laquan McDonald. I'll be your moderator today. My name is Almethea Franklin. I'm a criminal justice professor at Governor State University. My areas of research looks at the intersections of race, class, gender, and the law, mass incarceration, and police-citizen encounters. I would like to take a moment to introduce our wonderful panel today, which includes the play's director and producer, Shepsu Aku, who is a founding member of Impact and has developed several critically acclaimed works for Impact. We are joined by Andrea J. Diamond, the director of the radio play, Black and Blue. We are joined by David Shanks, actor, writer, and former police officer in Chicago, and also Gerald Hamilton, retired homicide detective and foster parent to over 70 youth in the Inglewood community. Welcome, you guys. It's great to have you on the panel today as we have this very candid conversation about the play Black and Blue, and we begin to discuss these issues that involve policing and citizens around our country. So welcome and thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. So again, we've assembled this panel together because we want to explore this relationship and the tensions between the Black Lives Matter movement and law enforcement. As well, we would like to look at what it means to be in law enforcement and what does it mean to be a part of law enforcement and as an African-American police officer working within various communities throughout the city of Chicago. So this conversation comes at a time in our country where we've seen recent events in the media around the killing of Black men and women by police officers that have sparked expressions of outrage and injustice across our country. So during these nationwide protests that followed after the George Floyd killing, after the Breonna Taylor murder, what we have seen across the country is protesters, politicians, religious leaders, and other groups starting to call for reform, right? Especially with policing. So while the world is watching these cases play out in the media and the criminal justice system, we would like to use this moment as a teachable moment for the country, right? We want to use this as a moment where we can have conversations about what we're seeing happening in the media and what we're seeing happen on our streets. So let's begin our discussion today talking about this time of social unrest that we're experiencing in the United States and between police officers and citizens. So I would like to ask Andrea, if you can kind of start the conversation off for us and talk about what ways do you see the conversation about the play Black and Blue, how do you see that factoring into this dynamic of racialized tensions that we have or that we're seeing in the US right now?
Well, I think that Black and Blue is a very particular story dealing with some very specific challenges that our communities face across the country. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to use this play to reach out, to begin conversations, to talk about community, to talk about the challenge of policing, particularly the way that it's done now. But I think it's really what is the point of telling stories about these things, the power of story, the way that people can engage with characters, which gives them a little bit of space to understand and see the humanity of everyone's story as you tell it. That's kind of the point of theater, I believe. And I think that this piece as I think I'd mentioned to some folks earlier, this piece for me was one that brought me again and again to what could be done when you speak to things such as this kind of tension, because it brings a certain level of humanity to police officers, and police officers are in a horrible position all of the time, and they visit that trauma then on the communities that they are meant to serve. And so this is a story that we don't often see, and it challenges us all to understand that there are complexities here. So I think that's the value of this particular story.
Okay, thank you for that. How about Shepsu? Sorry about that. What are your thoughts as being the writer of the play and working so close with Andrea on bringing these things bringing these topics and issues to light? What was kind of your thinking and motivations behind putting together a play of this magnitude?
Well, okay, so a couple things. One, let's get the name straight so Andy can quit giving me side eye.
I'm sorry.
Shepsu Eyaku is the name that I write under. Why did I do this play? And sort of what was that like, I was actually commissioned to work with another theater in Portland that was trying to balance out a series of monologues called Hands Up, that was done by Keith Joseph Atkins in New York, that had 7 Black writers writing about what it meant to live essentially under the yoke of police oppression. And then you had The Red Door, which was doing that play already and wanted to do a play that also looked at police officers. And that was the first time that I had been around that many police officers. And then also in that place separate from Chicago. So I wasn't sort of in it from the direct personal trauma of Chicago police, but I was in a different city sort of dealing with that. And honestly, there was just one conversation above all the rest that stood out. They're in a particular sort of political space in Portland, and I tend to lean very hard into the things that I wanted to talk about, and they have to balance a lot of things there. So the piece specifically that drew me to it was about a cop, and he was telling us this story about diner and doing his bookkeeping there at the end of the day about his reports and what happened. And it was a cute little quaint story, but it wasn't holding my attention. But the whole jump into the story was, yeah, this was right after I got beat to within an inch of my life by somebody who was having a psychotic break on the job, and I refused to shoot him. Okay. And the dramatist in me was like, that's the story. And the answer was, no, it's not. We're going to talk about this, sort of situation. And so that was the jumping off point for me. It was, what does it mean to make those types of choices? What does it mean to be in that place emotionally? And how does one go back to work when one doesn't feel safe in their own job? And then the thing I think that was the most critically important of that was that, and then all the other police officers around him then felt imperiled by those choices and felt that he wasn't trustworthy in the workspace. And so that was the jumping off point for me. Again, David said in the pre-show that I had an inherent sort of distrust of police, and that's a fair assessment. So this particular window into that line of thinking was just completely new to me, and that's what I wanted to take a look at, what that relationship was like. Again, J. David had spoken at length before about his relationship with his partner. So I had this sort of personal view, but this was a new piece together. And watching those two things sort of balance together, the tension between what it means to be vulnerable in that place, policing your own neighborhoods, making choices that other officers felt were imperiling both you and them. And then how does one do one's job under those circumstances? That became the impetus. My last little piece on that was there were a lot of emotions running high in that room when we were working on that. And one of the questions, one of the statements that one of the writers made in the room was I think it was the deputy chief of police, was something to the effect of, or you could just stop killing us. And it was such a simple statement and it was full of emotion and it was a very earnest assertion, the question for me then became, all right, so I know this cop is in the room who actually made that choice. And we're not going to ever talk about that in this particular environment. And I think that's just a very fertile place to begin the conversation. So that's how it launched. And to more to your question, and then to get to play with that with Andrea was a sheer joy. She came in and honestly, I don't want to overstate the amount of attentiveness that the cast required, but she was very much about making sure that they were grounded with every single thing that they said, knowing what it was, what their intentions were, so that the play wasn't full of tropes and stereotypes about how police were, that she made sure they were full and three-dimensional people. And the whole show turns on that. If that doesn't happen, then we have nothing. So it's pretty awesome. That's all I got.
Thank you for sharing that. That's great to hear how the story kind of unfolded and came to light for you in that moment and in that room, and how you took part of that story and you wanted to tell it in its rawest form. And I think the play actually captures that information. I want to go to Jay David and just talk, if you can talk to us a little bit more about your experience as an officer. I know in pre-show we kind of talked a little bit about, I believe you said you, as a police officer, you didn't really know, or as a Black police officer, whether you were part of the problem or part of the solution. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that in terms of how you felt? How did you kind of end up in that particular space, and kind of walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so I worked as a patrol officer in the patrol division for about 4.5 years before I went to instruct at the academy. And the bulk of my experience on the job, I just found myself in places where I mentioned earlier, everybody that I put handcuffs on looked like me. You know, everybody that I came into contact with, we had a similar life experience. We probably, came from a similar socioeconomic background. I grew up on 93rd and University on the South Side, and it took me 2 hours to get to high school every day. I went to Whitney Young, which is on the west side of the city, but it was more of a progressive environment, and it was definitely academic oriented. The community that I grew up in, a lot of the kids weren't reading on grade level. A lot of single parent, homes. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a house with my mother, father, and my grandparents. So I there, but for the grace of God, and that particular scenario, I think is really like the only thing that sort of saved me from sort of following the path of a lot of the brothers that I grew up with. First tokes of the blunt, first sips of beer, and then the escalation, of all of that. And then, a lot of real hyper, activity and no outlet, for it. We didn't have, I take that back. We used to have like a field house where you could go, and play after school, and it was publicly funded and it was part of the school. But as the money started to dry up, the field house closed. So a lot of those resources, were just sort of taken away, from the community. So again, I grew up, in this place where there weren't, a lot of opportunities. There's not a lot of job training. There weren't a lot of opportunities for people to really get into anything positive. And that energy has to go somewhere. And then on top of that, you're trying to eat and survive. So becoming a police officer and then coming back into that environment where I'm interacting with people that I grew up with. I would see cats that, I shoot ball with or, went to school with, in the street, all the time. And the reason that I felt like I wasn't necessarily part of the solution for helping, my people, my community, was because whenever I showed up, everything was already wrong and out of control. And my job was to go and ultimately put handcuffs on somebody and take somebody to jail because some law had been broken. And that, is not necessarily, a recipe, or an ingredient, that's part of the recipe for solving, the bigger systemic, problem, the bigger systemic issues that lead, to that. And as a Black police officer, I can only speak, to my experience. It gets kind of depressing because you see your people at their worst all the time. For every good story, I can tell you, about the job, I got 100, horrible, stories. Good stories were, really few and far between. So again, I think that it's a really complicated problem. It's a really complicated issue, the dynamic between the police and the community, particularly Black police officers and the community. Because again, I can only speak to my experience, but I never felt really fully embraced by the Chicago Police Department as an officer. 13,000 officers, less than a third, are people of color. I always felt like, I was tolerated and not necessarily celebrated. You know what I mean? On the job. I'd seen, other officers get away with things that, if a brother did that, he's suspended for 3 days, or, it was that kind of dynamic, again, my experience and a lot of things that I watched.
So it was that larger interaction within this institution of policing that has not always embraced people of color in terms of just employment. We've usually seen people of color at the opposite end, right, on the arresting side. But now here's an organization that's employing Black officers and not feeling like you're fully a part of that particular community. And that kind of speaks to our other panelists as well, who is also a retired police officer, retired homicide detective, that is working within the community with a group of young men that he fosters and provides opportunities to. So, Gerald, can you talk to us about what it means for you, or what it meant for you to be a homicide detective, and how has that translated into the work that you're doing with the young men within the community?
Yeah, thank you very much. And, I definitely, a lot of what Jay David said, resonates with me, obviously, because, we were literally working in the same community, Chicago Police Department, both of us. We had some similar experiences. I worked tactical and gang units my entire career, and then got promoted to homicide in '98. The thing is, just like you said, the biggest thing and the play Black and Blue really, really, man, I fell in love with it. I dragged so many people to it. They'll tell you, I was paying for people to come. Hey, you got to come see this thing, because it's a very unique dynamic. I worked with I was running around in part of my little youth with the Blackstone Rangers, a little street gang. My partner, David Lemieux, on the other hand, was in the Black Panther Party. So if you can understand, obviously the Black Panther Party was much more a dynamic and a good organization. At the same time, the whole dynamic of being Black and Blue, a lot of people don't understand it. You come into it, but we used to always emphasize, back to like what Jay David was saying, you have to be the thing. But I always had this impression that, we used to see people that got two different ways you can deal with the police. And like I said, you can stand on the sidewalk and spit and say F the police, but they don't care about that. The police don't care about that. They basically, there's a disconnect between the community and the police, and to begin with, but it's doubly and the Black community. And the irony of it is, we need the police and the Black community, obviously, at the same time. Like you said, you know, I've been on talk shows and stuff, and we've talked about this before. And I've heard, there was a young lady not too long ago said, well, F the police, we don't need no police, we're going to police our own community. Well, see, I see that as bullshit. You're not going to police your own community. You know, I mean, if they say right now, okay, all the police just left Inglewood, yeah, trust me and stuff. You know, I would explain that young lady, you'll be one of the first ones, you're kind of cute, you'll be one of the first ones to get snatched up off the street. And I don't know who you plan on calling to do anything about that. So that kind of stuff I think is nonsensical. You know, I'm not exactly sure, even with the more recent things, defund the police. I believe in definitely that has to be reforms of the police. A lot of the things that are happening right now, yeah, you got to crack a few eggs to make an omelet. So it's unfortunate. I mean, and I hate that, you know, obviously the impetus for a lot of these things is people getting killed with police officers, knees on their neck, things like that. I mean, any human being that sees that type of thing and stuff, you know, is going to reject that. They're going to reject for the most part, although, quite frankly, I've seen some police that apparently don't think that, you know, hopping out of a car and shooting somebody 16 times, walking away from you, you know, I mean, what is that? I mean, you know, so our thing, and my partner David, literally, I had to a couple times intercede because, like as Dave say, he was on the borderline of getting more than being told 662 stand down, because he's like, hey, you know, they would see some injustices, and you know, we were in this African-American Patrolman League, and our motto was, I am my brother's keeper. And that was absolutely true. And so that's the crux of the thing. You got a two-sided coin. You join the police department, you're going to have to come with your own consciousness and sense of community. And, you know, that as you said, these are the people that look just like us. They're depending on us to protect them and serve them. And occasionally we will have to arrest people. I had a guy tell me one time, hey, man, why don't you just give me a break? I said, not this time. I can't give you a break. I'm going to give the community a break because you're basically, you're terrorizing the community. So I'm going to give the community a break instead today. And today you just have to go to jail. But yeah, so that's how that worked. But for the most part, like I said, I always believed like we have to be, when I was an Area 2 detective up there, you know, I saw how prisoners there were guys in there for horrendous crimes, but they were knocking on the door. They want to go to the bathroom, and they had white detectives up there that was just, fuck them. I'm like, what? I mean, come on, man. You know, I mean, I'd get up. It wasn't my case. I'd go and lock the door and walk them to the bathroom. Take 5 minutes out of your day to do that. Humanity, you can't lose your humanity because you put on a blue uniform or you're a detective or whatever the case is. So I would see that. But I tell people all the time, if you don't have diversity in the police department, then you're back to what we grew up with. So I'm 65. So I grew up with, you know, in Detroit, the stress units and all this type of stuff and the Big Four and basically an occupation army. Well, we don't want that. Occupation army is not what we want in the Black community, you know, so you need diversity. I mean, even solving crimes, you need diversity to do that thing. But when you just got an old boys club, yeah, well, somebody beat the hell out of somebody, smack them up the side. They're very reluctant to the same guys that they go back out to Mount Greenwood and sit on the bar stools with. They're not going to say nothing. Well, I didn't see anything, you know, I didn't see it, you know, that type of thing. So I definitely believe it's a very important that we do have brothers and sisters in the police department. I can appreciate, like what Dave is saying, the frustration that you run into on a daily basis as well. But it's absolutely necessary that we be involved in there. We can't all just be on the sidewalk and say F the police and then that's not going to affect anything.
Right. So you bring up some very interesting points in your conversation when we're talking about the police. And so this question is pretty much for anyone. I just want to open up the discussion and let's start to talk about some of these larger issues that you guys bring up in terms of having your own consciousness when you're a police officer working within an institution that has these kinds of restraints on you, right? That when you put on the uniform that you're supposed to shed kind of who you are as a person, right? And embrace this ideology of policing. So when we start to talk about policing ideology and individuals who decide that they want to join the police force and bring about change within that force, how difficult is that for someone when you're working with an institution that's not so much open to change?
The premise of the question, I disagree with just a little bit. It's impossible to completely divorce who you are as a person, as a man, woman, on the police department from the way you police. Case in point, brother, 285 pounds, yoked out. He's going off when you show up in front of his house. He's cursing, he's screaming, no. And I told him, and it's on 10 at that point. I know a lot of officers that are terrified of that. And the first thing they thinking about doing is grabbing their gun, right? But to Gerald's point, the reason that you need brothers and sisters in the community is because my uncle is that dude. When he's upset about something, that's the way he expresses himself. So you have to be able to use your own sensibilities, use your own sensibilities to sort of see through, I guess, the anger and the passion of the moment. But we Black people, we passionate. You know what I mean? We talk with our hands. That's who we are, right? But a lot of white officers who aren't experienced in that, that's not the way they grew up. That's not the way they've never had conflict presented to them in that way. They'll immediately run to the lethal use of force because now they're operating from a place of fear as opposed to operating from a place of recognition and understanding, right? They hop out the car, he was, I feared for my life, or he was this, and he was aggressive while he was talking to me, and he approached the car, he was mad. His son, he had just cashed his check, and his son came and stole all of the money, and that was the rent money, or that was the grocery money. And of course he's upset, and of course I'm gonna whoop his ass. And any Black daddy would react, the same way. But again, a lot of times, that's why it's important. And I just wanted to sort of, like I said, frame the question, or at least shade it in a way that we can't divest who we are as men and women, as people. You got to bring your whole experience to a job like policing.
I would throw something in that again, I guess we're all just picking on your question now, which is kind of unfair.
That's great.
But my thing is, I am less interested in the individual foible, and I am much more interested in the fact that the institution is willfully blind about what it is asking people to do. So by that, I mean, I have now, after these years of working in Portland, I have sat around with police officers unions and police brass and so forth. And there is just a wholehearted reluctance to acknowledge that on its face, the job is destabilizing. On its face, the job isn't just stressful, it lends itself to desperate act and desperate action, and that is in the fabric of the job. So right now the conversation is, no, it's that officer who can't handle the job, who needs the therapy, who needs the support system, who needs the so on forth. If we don't actually acknowledge that on jump from day one, your trauma is going to begin with this job, and we're gonna have to figure out how to help you manage that and mitigate that. How much time do you spend on and how much time do you spend out? I mean, just in basic things with like soldiers, like you get a year deployed, they bring your ass home. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not gonna leave you in that space because I accept that this job does these specific things to you. And I have not been in a room where I have gotten a single higher up in the police department to acknowledge that inherently the job itself is destabilizing, and that so we have to then be proactive in dealing with our police force from the first day.
Yeah, when I remember the thing that stuck in my mind after the production, well, when we were working on it, and David was in town, and we were talking a little bit, recording a little bit, I think, whatever happened to that recording, about what reform you would want, what you'd want to see. And the thing I remember most vividly was David, you talking about how you're in a combat zone without any relief, without it for endlessly, every day, go out again and again and again, and no one ever stops. No one takes you out of the field. No one rotates you into some other kind of deployment, And I think that particularly it would seem to me, in the light of how militarized we have made policemen, I mean, walking out looking like you're going to a ride every day, you would think that they would be clearer on how, what the weight of that is on any human being, and how that is going to be, as you put it, destabilizing. Yeah. So I think that's huge. It is really much more about the system itself. And when we talk about reforms and we talk about, what's necessary, even when they talk about defunding, which throws people off their, that throws them off their feet, what we're really talking about is, where do you spend the money? How do you spend the money? Yeah. Should we be sending them out in tanks? Probably not.
There's another piece to it, that I think a lot of people miss as well. Police are asked to do. You have to be a psychiatrist. You have to be a domestic
counselor.
Domestic counselor. You got to be a therapist. You have to be a truant officer, in addition to your duties as a police officer. And it's such a tall order. Going back to what you were saying, Andrea, you can't work in Inglewood or work in districts like 6 and 7. You can't work in these districts for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years straight without it having some sort. You're constantly reigniting the trauma that you're going to see, over and over and over and over again. So there has to be some sort of, I say that to say, there has to be some sort of rotationary process that's implemented in these faster districts of officers. You also have to destigmatize therapy and asking for help, and not having officers feel like their job is in jeopardy if they ask for this help, right? If you show up, and as a homicide detective, Gerald, you saw it all the time. You seeing death over and over and over again. I had a FTO tell me, when I first saw my first dead body, on the job, and he kind of nudged me like, the first one, huh? Because I was just stuck. I was looking at this dude that was dead. It was looking back at me as a dead body. I'd never seen that, before. I'd seen people shot in the neighborhood, but I never watched anybody die, like right in front of me. And it was something about that moment that was like, whoa. And he tapped me and was like, you get used to it. That right there was like, no, no, you shouldn't get used to that, Yeah, I mean, you're accustomed to it, because it's part of the job, but don't just glide over the fact that that's not going to be something that's going to affect you, in some way, in some deeper way. And many of our officers, operate under this constantly thickening callus of, I'm used to it. I've seen that, and again, the disconnect with what's really human, in the moment and in the experience, it affects the way that you police. And when you meet people, again, your apathy level, begins to dip down. You're not, vested and connected. You start looking at things and people, like things, arrestees, heads. You're looking at people like, you're an offender, and you're going to lie to me too. You're going to bullshit me too. You're part of this whole, mess. And when you begin to take on that kind of thinking, you've changed. and you can't be effective in service to the community when those things start to happen. So part of any constructive conversation about reform has to include some sort of sense of giving officers safe spaces and places without fear of reprisal or fear of reassignment or fear of even losing your job, right? Without that fear and without that stigma, but also taking them out of the combat zones, like we talked about before. If you've been here for 2 years, we probably need to move you, to another spot, so you can kind of regroup. There's a tremendous difference between working in Inglewood and working in Hyde Park, or working in, working up north, somewhere. They're two completely different worlds as far as policing is concerned. So again, I think those have to be, really constructive parts of the conversation for change.
So when you talk about that, J. David, and you bring up a lot of interesting points for this conversation and for a larger conversation about this destigmatizing how police officers do their job and the things that they need in the process of them doing that job. How does this also feed into or play into this us versus them mentality when it comes to the community, right? That is police officers versus citizens, instead of us seeing more of this collaborative relationship of us all working together that is not a us versus them. And anyone can chime in on this idea of us versus them when you're on.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about the us versus them. It's good that you made that dynamic, because see, that's the duality of it. When you join the police department, it's already, of course, everybody watches a lot of police procedurals and everybody thinks they know what the police do or what they should do and things of that nature. And the police look at that entirely differently. They're like, well, we're here to serve the citizens, but at the end of the day. So there's a big disconnect between just traditional policing, as is modeled as it is. They already look at the citizens don't have a clue, again, like you said, there's the blue bond, and they just like, hey, we only got ourselves here because the citizens don't know what we do. And, of course, they have unreasonable expectations. And, of course, the citizens look at it different. I called 911. How come you weren't here 2 minutes ago? As David can tell you, just even a simple thing as that. The modern police and has computers in their car. They might have 6 jobs sitting on that computer when they come out. So they have to choose to go to the 2 brothers fighting with a knife in their mama's kitchen versus, even though you did call 911 first about your car is missing out of your garage, but people don't get that. By the time they get there, they're already pissed off. But back, I was getting a little off with that, but I'm just saying that the police look at us as a lot of them traditionally look at us against them. Now you add that to the black and blue element of it being police. Well, of course, we're aligned with the police department. I went through the police academy 2 times because I was a suburban officer as well before I was with Chicago. So I went through the academy twice. The bottom line is those are integrated into you just like any other Army training, military training and things like that. Of course, esprit de corps and all this and that and stuff. So it's different now. Well, I explained to a lot of young black officers, listen, this is how it works. Yes, if there's a 10-1, which is an officer calling for assistance, I don't care if you're white or Ku Klux Klan or whatever you are. If you're the police, then I'm running to your assistance. And I'm pretty much have the assurance that, me as a black officer, if I'm under fire and I call a 10-1 officer need assistance, I'm going to get white officers coming to my assistance as well, putting themselves in the line of fire to respond to protect me. So, but that being the dynamic that we have as black and blue officers, I explained to them, blue is a job. Black is a reality. That means you had experiences as a young black person, man or woman growing up. So you don't forget those. Well, I don't got nothing to do with that now because I'm with the blue. I bleed blue. Well, that's bullshit, and like I said, and it's easy enough to be reminded of that because once you take that uniform off and I'm sure Jay Davis probably had the same experiences, you'll get stopped. I'm driving in my Hummer, I got stopped and, and they come with a whole different demeanor. or once they find out, hey, look, my badge is bigger than yours, hey, well, hey, what's happening, man? Okay, blah, 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 but sometimes they come and you already see how that would have went if you weren't the police. So like I said, when you take that uniform off, you're going to still be black. And, so you can't forget that. So there's the whole dynamic that you have to, that's the challenge to black officers. Like you said, like Dave said, you cannot lose your humanity. You can't come out here and become blue. And then just the things that we were subjected to growing up in the 60s and 70s, how I was policed, and that was different. It was occupation army, and I was subjected to some police abuses and stuff. And it didn't stop me from becoming the police. And more ironically, my partner David Lemieux, coming all the way from the Black Panther Party, becoming the police. But you can be the police of consciousness, and that's what you're required to do. You're there not just to get a paycheck, or it's no point you thinking that you're going to be like he said, embraced by the police department, because don't get it wrong. I mean, right now with this present administration that's been here for the last 4 years, it's really, really coming to a head. It was already like that when he was on the department and myself, but now it's coming to a head. People are like, well, we're the FOP, we endorse this guy 100%, and all the brothers and sisters like, what? We're not endorsing that bullshit, and like I said, but we already know he talking about, the white police. That's cool, because you're saying keep the status quo. I mean, we're not forgetting that the police origins came from the slave,
bring it a slave.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So, I mean, basically, you have to remember the police are, as they say, like what did Daley say? Their job is to maintain disorder. So I mean, and that's I mean, it was a misspoke on his part, but in truth, it was what it is. You want to police department is to maintain the status quo, and that's what some of these police officers, FOP, I have to speak on them nationally and locally. They're with that. Yeah, we want it to be just like. We're not really comfortable with this whole Black Lives Matter or whatever it is. I mean, I'm not 100% down with everything. I don't believe in you can go down and bust out all the windows you want and that's your reparations. I think that's bullshit. But at the same time, absolutely, it's okay. We got to start having some hard conversations about, Black lives do matter. At the same time, you could check the record. I've been on record saying, hey, we're not going to not talk about the elephant in the room, because I was on a show and they say, do you think the police disrespect the Black community? I said, absolutely. That happens for a lot, and we're here to try and, diminish that to some degree. But there's a whole lot of Black people disrespecting the Black community too. It's not just police, like that body that Dave was talking about. I doubt that the police shot him, so we want to hold, I don't want to get away from that we want to hold the police accountable. I definitely do. And all Black police officers, at least Black police officers of consciousness, are in total agreement with that. And like he said, I have to police in my community, and I'm in South Shore over here. And I've been the police over here for many years. I was 13 years in gang tactical units out of 3rd District before I went to homicide. And when I was on homicide, I covered all the South Side. So the point of it is, I see these same people at Jewel Osco, so you want to police in this community, kick everybody in the ass, and as you say, plant guns and drugs on things. Hey, trust me. Like you said, I play basketball with some of the guys I sent to the penitentiary. I've got about 40 or 50. I raised 100 foster sons, and I've got a lot of them working through this Hamilton House enterprise. But I've got 40 or 50 guys right now working and providing them housing. And that's what I'm talking about that you have to do. And guess what? At least 12 or 13 of them guys, if you go back and check their arrest report, you're going to see Hamilton on that arrest report. But that's okay, because they're the same thing. They understand how the game works. Well, hey, you caught me dirty, and and I tell people, hey, don't bitch up now. If you're selling drugs, and don't worry about the postman, the mailman. But hey, if you're a stick-up man and the police get you, well, you wasn't doing your job good, and he was doing his job good, so now you're going to jail. But that being said, we have to live in this community. So even if you didn't have a consciousness, you would just have to be totally ignorant to think you could just go kick everybody in the ass, and that, you know, I mean, everybody knows where I live, you know, so you see my point.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for sharing that. Does anyone else want to chime in on the us versus them?
I just want to add one quick thing. The us versus them piece of it. I think a lot of times, going back to what Bro Hamilton just said, there was a cartoon of that they ran years ago. It was a sheepdog and a coyote, and it was a flock of sheep down at the bottom. The sheepdog's job was to watch and protect the sheep. The coyote's job was to steal one of the sheep so he could eat them, right? And what they would do, the way the cartoon is set up, it's a time clock, right? Like you going to work. The sheepdog would walk up and take his time card with his little lunchbox, and the coyote would walk up right behind him and they would say good morning to each other. Hey, what's up, man? How you doing? What's going on, brother? Hey, everything good. He'd clock in, and the coyote would clock in, and their jobs are now polar opposite. As a police officer, my job is to catch you doing what you're doing. Your job is to do what you do. And sometimes they get away and you win, and I don't catch you. And sometimes the police win and you get caught.
Right.
Now, the real players in the game, they understand that. They understand that, look, if I'm going to do what I'm going to do out here in the street, law averages will say that eventually I'm going to get caught, right? It's unrealistic to be in the life like that and think that you won't get caught. And just like with police, it's the same thing. It's never, or at least with me and my partner, when we worked, it was never anything that was personal. The second that it started being like personal, that's when you got into trouble. That's when people was shooting up the house, and that's when people was, because it ain't hard to find out where police live. It ain't hard at all. But I always like to, sort of conduct myself, and my partner and I, we like to conduct ourselves in a manner. I'm gonna treat people the way I want people to treat my mama, my sister, my daddy. My daddy is out in the world like that. And I would hate for somebody, to be going off on him and treating him, any other way than, look, the handcuffs is on, man. You got to go this time. It ain't nothing, bro. I caught you doing what you was doing. You dirty. You got to go ahead and go and sit down for a minute. That's what it is, right? But as far as like, the activism that's going on now is warranted, and I love it personally. And I think that young people should stand up and should demand to be respected as human beings in this society, right? But also at the same time, if you're wrong and you out of pocket, the law says you can't run downtown and bust Marshall Field's window out. Now, is Marshall Field still open? Or even if it's Macy's. You can't run downtown, and bust the windows out and steal stuff. You can't do that. Me personally, I'm glad that they're doing it downtown as opposed to on 79th and Cottage Grove, you know what I mean? Where we tearing up our own stuff. At least we've taken it to a level where now we getting attention. Now you running up in the water tower. You know what I mean? Now, I completely get that. Let's not tear our own stuff up. Let's really go where it's going to make some impact, if that's what the goal is. But again, I honestly feel like there's a place where activism and law enforcement, particularly Black law enforcement, can meet, right? And I think there's a space where those two entities can come together to move and work in conjunction against the bigger system. Because again, the way they get us all the time is they want to divide and conquer. They want the Black police officer to feel bad about doing his job and providing for his family by legal means. Now, again, I mean, a legal means of employment, right? I'm not saying that choking somebody out and shooting people unjustly and putting guns on people and planting dope on people, all of that is dirty as hell. And from my experience, cops that get down like that, eventually that shit catches up with them. Eventually, right? But you live to work 20 years, 25 years on the job, right? by doing it the right way, right? Are arrests rough sometimes? Absolutely, because people don't want to go to jail. That's just what it is. I've had people tell me, look, man, I just got out the joint. I did 15 years. I'm not going back. And if me going back, if you and me got to get into it, for me to go back, I'm finna fuck you up. Right. And that's what it is. And I understand that, because again, when you take the job, there's certain things that will come along with the job. That's just what it is. It's just unfortunate there's such a divide between the community and law enforcement, but I really see a lane, particularly because the police department is divided. I've said it before, I will say it again, and Brett Hamilton will probably attest to this. There's a black department in Chicago. There's a white department in Chicago. It's always been that way. It's always been that way. You know, and if people don't want to accept that, you know, or buy into that, the white boy that's the head of the patrolmen's union, who's a firm supporter of the current administration, that dude can't speak for me. You know, I'm not on the job anymore, but he don't speak for my partner still on the job. He don't speak for the other, you know, black officers that are still on the job. But what they do is they will lump all of us together and say the Chicago Police Department stands behind the administration. No, they don't. No, they don't. So again, that's a lot of what I think the issue is. It's a divide and conquer thing.
And I think that's huge.
Kind of segue into kind of the second and last half of our conversation is, how do we move the conversation forward, right? How do we start to talk about these things, right? Reflecting on what's there, reflecting on what has been done. And now how can we move the conversation to this new area of change? How do we begin to change the dynamic that exists within the institution of policing? How do we start to change citizens' mentality toward policing? And what I noticed recently, and I don't know if you guys have watched the media over the last couple of weeks, I know today it was part of a story discussing the licensing of officers. Officers should be licensed in order to become police officers or in order to be police officers. Do you think that should be a part of that larger conversation when we're talking about change? Or should we start to think about other things prior to that we should be addressing?
Yeah. I wanted to throw out, but I wanted to give Andy a chance to finish that thought she tried to get in before I jump in there.
Sorry, Andy.
Oh, no, thank you. I was just saying that I think that's huge, what David was saying, that there is an opportunity, and as I was saying, this play has haunted me, continues to haunt me, partly because I think it raises, or it could be part of that opportunity of having a conversation with police officers, most particularly Black police officers, and members of the community. I think there is a huge opportunity to try to find a way to bridge that conversation, to make that conversation happen, and also to include people who are facilitating and talking to and speaking to the trauma that's being visited on both sides. So, you know, when you think about who might be involved in that and how you could shape that, when I think about what this piece of work that we did, I feel as though it could be kind of an anchor piece to something much larger, to something that whose purpose was, or the purpose of which was to go into communities, you know, use this story to then bring people into the room and have a conversation, a larger workshop perhaps, because I think that's it. I think that opportunity is there. And I think this moment makes it clearer than ever, this moment of violence. And by the way, you want to think about, they broke up downtown one time. Do you know it is more boarded up now than right after they broke it up? Because they were so worried about the possibility of violence after this election, this never-ending election. It is like a fortress down there. And frightening when you think about it. What does that tell you about what the police, or actually the administration, thinks about the community?
Right.
You know, I think that speaking to that is a very important thing to do right now. And I think this might be, these conversations are the beginning of that. Thanks for making the spaceships.
No, we're good. Here's my problem when we get around to talking solution. I don't think you can talk solution from a place of dishonesty. I have never sat in a room with police higher brass that would acknowledge the inherent racism built into the system, that would acknowledge the institutional nature of it, that would acknowledge the policies and differential policing, that would acknowledge the process of bringing Black kids into the system as early as possible to make them easier to deal with as their criminal lives develop. All of these sort of conversations about where does the distrust of the police department come from are always a conversation around as though those opinions were not arrived at through honest means. They are.
Yeah.
If the police department is never going to acknowledge, if they defend the status quo and the status quo is racism, and if you doubt it, 70 million people just voted for the dude who is the overt racist, the overt misogynist, the overt xenophobe. 70 million people was like, that's our dude. Still, I know him, I know what I'm getting, and I still want that.
Yep.
70 million people said that. Their police departments reflect that.
Yeah.
And if we don't walk out into the conversation with the police department, I'm just going to have to call bullshit before we get started. If you're not going to begin with accepting your differential policing policies, your race, I'll give you a differential policing policy that I just find hysterical, right? So I live on the north side of Chicago. I live not too far from the lake, right next to a university. Occasionally, my life gets a little busy. I literally forget to put the new sticker on the license plate.
Yes.
Will park my car on the street. That car can sit on the street for 6 months. I kid you not, a half a block from a police station. It can sit on my car for 6 months. If I drive to my cousin's house on the south side, I don't even get to park that car before I get pulled over about that on the back of my car. Yeah. Which means that somebody has decided there's a policy. We will run every fucking plate we see, period.
Yeah. You know, that's a good point that he's saying about that. See, that's the one thing that I liked about policing, being a Black police. And we used to explain this to a lot of young police. This is like a one job that, now I agree with 100% he said, law enforcement are all across this country in America is systemic racism, and they won't admit that. They were like, no, we don't acknowledge that and whatever. Now, hopefully, if this new administration comes in, we'll, like I say, we can get to some more honest conversations. You're going to have to drag the Neanderthals across the line for that to happen. Mm-hmm. But this being said, but just on a personal level, when Dave and I were out there, the thing is, like I used to tell the police officer, this is the thing about this job. You got all the discretion in the world. And I sent a lot of people to the penitentiary, but I dare say I sent a whole lot of people in the opposite direction with conversations and things like that. And he'll know, again, our kids get criminalized and, at an early age, we have people that come from out of this community that have apprehension of a young 16-year-old male Black. We don't necessarily, I got half of them, 6 or 7 of them was growing up in my house at the same time I was being the police, so it was, no intimidation there. But we have discretion. And that's why I say, look, the police department, and he'll tell you he worked in those squad cars. Look, and you stop somebody, you could give them a warning just as soon as you could give them a ticket about that sticker. Hey, man, you forgot to put that sticker on. But we get police differently in the Black community for the most part. It's and that's the reality. It's like you said. I mean, that's just the reality of how it is. So those are some of the things that we have to talk about. But a lot of this stuff is going to come from the top down, and that's all there is to it. If I'm the superintendent of police and I'm telling you, Chip Sue, I'm not going to tolerate that shit, what you're doing right here. But then on the other hand, if you got police department, hey, those guys are some real ass kickers over there in 7 and 6, man, they doing a good job. They went down there and they kicked their ass and took names. And, if that's the, then that's what young officers get. Hey, man, I want to get a departmental commendation too, man. So that's it. And like you said, we don't have the apprehension. I mean, I'm not no fool. Don't get me wrong and stuff. I mean, if I feel you're in danger in my life, you could be Black or blue. I mean, I might have to shoot you. But like you said, he'll tell you how many times they've had police shootings. And it was the little white boy and stuff. And we like, yeah, he did have a gun. He shouldn't have probably had that. He ran down the alley. But I've chased a lot of guys down gangways. And I gave him that 5 seconds. Hey, drop the fucking gun, and they dropped it and they lived. But in that case, hey, I saw a gun, I can shoot his ass in the back, and all I'm gonna do is get an award, a medal, and that's the message that they were getting from top.
Yeah, there's another thing. I mean, back to Shep Sue's point, I've been in roll call, right? Mm-hmm. And the desk and the watch sergeant came in and said, "Hey, y'all, it ain't enough parkers and movers tonight. Everybody get a new parking book. Everybody get a new ticket book. I want at least 4 parkers and 4 movers." And basically, what that means is that, which is why a lot of cops feel like, are we hoes for the city? Go out there and go get my money. You know what I mean? It was go write the parking tickets, go write the moving violation tickets. And if you want to work on a tactical team or a gang team, that's the incentive. That's the carrot. You got the numbers got to be up. So it's a game of politics, and the police oftentimes, there's a beautiful piece in the play where Shep Sue talks about the weaponization of the police. The city uses the department as a cudgel against the community. But unfortunately, a lot of times the people in Black communities, poor communities, are the ones that, are at the butt of all of that. You'll never be told, to go do that shit up north. You'll never be told to go do that, downtown. I used to tell people all the time, I get in the comparison of a guy coming out of a liquor store on Happy's Liquor on 79th and Cottage, and he got a brown paper bag. It's an ice cold beer, in there. He dirty. He got his hard hat on, his hands. The brother been working, and probably all day he been looking forward to this beer because he didn't work hard for it. The second he twists the cap on it and take that sip, he drinking on the public way. The police is smashing on it. But at the same time, down in Millennium Park, if a white boy is down there, he got his blanket spread out on the grass. They eating grapes and cheese, and he popped that bottle of wine and pour it, in the little wine glass. Him and his lady down there enjoying a cool afternoon. It's the exact same crime being committed, right? But if I run up on that dude, I'm a jerk. That's just the citizen enjoying himself, and he ain't causing no problems. But again, on the South Side, it's a completely different situation. So again, these are things to the point that come from the top. They come from the leadership, up top. They filter down, to the foot soldiers in the field. And I'll take it a step further. That's the reason why no American president has ever stepped up to the microphone and said, "I apologize for the atrocity of the institution of slavery on behalf of this nation." Because the second that they do that, whoever it is, Obama, Biden, Bush, whoever, Black, white, whatever, the second that they do that, to your point, Shep Sue, I've acknowledged that that's wrong. I've acknowledged that that's a problem. And now the impetus is on me to do something about that, to correct that wrong, right? That's why nobody will ever say it. They're happy in a lot of regards with the status quo and the way things are. We touched on it a little bit earlier. You guys have to understand where policing came from. Policing came after the slaves were freed, and white people were afraid that now the slaves are going to turn on us and there's going to be retribution. So now we need these marshals and these sheriffs and these bands of people, white people with guns, to protect these landowners and property owners from retribution from slavery. So policing itself birthed out of the guilt of white America. That's my and again, it is just sort of permeated, generation after generation after generation, and that's what current policing is.
Yeah. Just on the resource end, because I know somebody asked us about resources, that there's a particularly good and detailed conversation about that NPR did on the evolution of American policing. So if you want to go ahead and look that stuff up, it's there for the taking, just a couple of clicks, and you can find it.
I'd also like to point out that a lot of people, just common people, aren't aware that some states actually operate under a police bill of rights, right? So there's certain things that police will be allowed to do, will not be held accountable for doing, simply because they fall within that Bill of Rights that are out. This is part of the job, and these are the things that we will not punish you for. And those are why that Bill of Rights, that's a lot of times what the FOP and other agencies will fall on when they say that, well, why can't we bring charges against this officer for X, Y, and Z? Because it stands in direct violation and contradiction to the Police Bill of Rights. A lot of people aren't even aware that that exists, right? But again, I think things like that and buffers and institutions like that are all part of the systemic problem. If we can tear those things down, I personally think that police officers should be insurable, right? If you're a driver and before you get behind the wheel of a car, you have to have auto insurance. Yeah. If you have an accident, points go up on your license, right? Then you get to a place where they'll drop you because you're uninsurable. Mm-hmm. If you're a police officer and you have 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 CR numbers, registered complaints, the points should be assessed to that particular officer. And when you get to a space where you tapped out on your points, they should be looking into you. That's when you need to pull that officer and you need some retraining, man, or some behavioral evaluation. And now we're looking at you to get rid of you because that bad apple thing is real. You can't say that the entire police department is bad. You can't say that, right? I'm a Black man in America who has dealt with the police as a citizen, and I'm a Black man in America who has worked as a police officer. I've worked with some good people, Black and white, on the department. I've relied on some white people on the job that I would probably trust more so than my own family. And I can say that honestly. So you can't say that the entire department, is corrupt. However, I will say that that sense of holding officers accountable, right? When that is not in place, that's going to allow the improper behavior to continue. Like I said at the beginning, if I had a house note and I got 2 car payments and my kid is in private school, I'm not going to let because you living out your slave master fantasy on this brother, right? If the 4 officers who were there that day, they should be held accountable because somebody could have said, that's enough. I've seen officers pull other officers off people. I've done that before. I've pulled officers off. Hey, dog, that's enough. That's enough.
So it's that accountability piece that needs to be there, that more officers need to hold their peers accountable.
It has to be.
When we're talking about police work. I just want to jump over to Andrea for some final thoughts before we wrap the conversation for today. Andrea, you had something that you wanted to...
Well, I think it was connected to what David was saying and what you had mentioned about licensing. He's talking about insuring. We're just talking, and that's all a part of how can we figure out how to make people accountable. And part of it is, we're talking about people's humanity. And if your humanity isn't going to be enough to keep you on the straight and narrow, then there have to be other systems to put you in check. And I do think that, the FOP got mentioned a couple of times, that Officers' Bill of Rights or Police Officers' Bill of Rights. The idea that what has been convoluted, the FOP isn't serving, it says it's a union, but it's not dealing as a union. I come out of the labor union tradition. That's not what it's doing. It's being protectionist. Yeah. Almost completely. I'm not saying they don't deal with it,
lobbyists,
but in terms of how they're doing it, sorry.
They're lobbyists.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's like, let's take the mask off now. We got to be honest about what's happening here. This isn't about protecting a good worker who is being abused somehow or falsely accused. You're about protecting him no matter what.
Exactly.
And so that's the problem. Yeah. How do we begin with an honest assessment of what is happening in the system and then address it accordingly? And there are many, many steps that need to be taken. Many levels of work that have to be done. And I think we've mentioned several of them in terms of possibilities and approaches today.
Yeah, it's an interesting part of the defund the police conversation as well, because the unfortunate labeling aside, the defund the police conversation is about resource allocation, particularly as it pertains to what's your area of expertise, how can we best divide up these particular city services around agencies that are better? For instance, the police department does a notoriously poor job in dealing with mental health issues.
Right.
Perhaps they're not the people to call for mental health issues. And so, but what you watch happen is that there is this parsing of it, particularly in the negotiating around citizen board reviews and whether or not police officer conduct can be viewed or can't be reviewed, and whether or not police funding is an untouchable thing. I feel like I live in the 80s sometimes, and we're talking about the nuclear arms back. We can give them more money, but we can't never take it back. Like, that's how it is in the Reagan years, was more missiles. Yes. What do you, okay, well, we can still have some more missiles, but not as many. Nope. If you touch missile money, it's over. Like, that's how I feel about the police department right now. It's, as long as we're getting, you know, armored personnel carriers and all of that other stuff, all the politicians can keep running on that. But I don't see how that's a service to the rest of us. And so there's just a whole lot of politics in policing. And for me, I am very much interested in moving the conversation away from how any one individual officer is a good officer or is a bad officer. I am particularly interested in institutional accountability. The first part being your job just fucks people up. Why don't we just deal with that? The second part being your job is inherently about protecting the status quo, and I'll be playing with that. So it's about protecting money and racial privilege and the perceptions of which places are safe to live and not safe to live, who gets served and who gets protected is part of that metric. We never get to have that honest conversation because Black people are always trying to be really polite about the racism we're dealing with. So if we're not going to actually talk about that, then we're not really talking about solutions, we're talking about wordplay. How do I create a new phrase that sounds nice, but doesn't actually deal with anything? That's my 2 cents on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Shamsu. So this brings us to the end of our very candid conversation today. I would like to take the opportunity to thank our panel for joining us as we explore these, again, very difficult topics, but very real topics, things that we need to keep at the forefront, that we need to make sure that we're having these conversations. And like Shepsu just stated, is that we have to be honest with ourselves, right? And have these difficult conversations, no matter what they are, in order to address these issues of race, policing, inequalities, injustices that we continue to face in this country. So there's no question that long-term change is going to require this profound shift in the way that we're used to doing things, especially in this relationship between Black people and the state, right? Black people and government. So this shift has always been kind of eluded in the United States since its founding days, right? We've never really had a true conversation that addressed the plight of people of color, in particular Black people, in particular African-American people, right? So this conversation was great. And once again, I want to thank you guys for allowing me to be your moderator. And I hope that we got to a lot of the issues as far as we can carry this conversation forward. And as others come and watch our production, that they are tuning into the play and getting these messages that Andrea has directed and Shepsu has put on the screen for us, right? Because I feel like as long as we can see it, we can move forward, and that'll keep the conversation going, and we can bring people into the conversation and have these difficult conversations. Indeed. So thank you again, and enjoy your day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.